Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The briefing room at Fort Bragg was colder than usual that December morning, but Staff Sergeant Ben Cross had endured worse. 23 years of service across 3 different wars had taught him to read the subtle signs that separated routine missions from the kind that changed you forever. The way Colonel Harrison's fingers drummed against the classified folder with a rhythm that seemed almost compulsive. The absence of the usual administrative personnel who normally cluttered these meetings with their clipboards and regulations. The fact that this briefing was happening at 5 in the morning with no official record of the meeting on any duty roster. But it was more than that. Harrison himself looked different. Older somehow, as if the contents of that folder had aged him years in the span of days. Dark circles ringed his eyes like bruises, and his usually immaculate uniform showed wrinkles that suggested he'd slept in his office again. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that Ben had never heard before, the kind of shake that came from seeing something that fundamentally altered your understanding of the world. "Before we begin," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to understand that what I'm about to show you will change your life forever. Once you see this file, once you accept this mission, there's no going back to the world you knew before. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Ben felt ice form in his stomach. In 23 years of service, Harrison had never spoken to him like this. The colonel was a man who'd seen combat in 4 different theatres, who'd been decorated for valour under fire, who'd never shown fear in the face of any human enemy. "Sir, what exactly are we dealing with?" Harrison opened the folder with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. The first photograph he slid across the table showed what appeared to be a massive drilling operation, but the equipment was wrong. Too sophisticated, too purposeful. This wasn't geological surveying. This was excavation with military precision. 6 weeks ago, one of our deep monitoring stations in Antarctica detected seismic activity that shouldn't exist. Vibrations coming from beneath the ice sheet that followed patterns too regular to be natural. When we sent a team to investigate, Harrison's voice trailed off, and he pulled out a second photograph. Ben stared at the image and felt reality shift around him. It showed a creature that belonged in medieval manuscripts, not scientific documentation. Humanoid, but impossibly tall, with wings that stretched beyond the frame of the photograph. Even frozen in ice, even captured in a simple image, there was something about it that made Ben's vision blur around the edges. "What am I looking at, sir?" "Something that's been waiting under the ice for a very long time. Something that our science teams believe is not entirely dead." Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Ben, I need you to understand something. This isn't the first discovery of its kind. We've been finding these things for decades, hidden in ice around the world. But this one is different. It's affecting people just by being near it." "Affecting them how?" "They start having dreams, shared dreams. They begin speaking in languages that don't exist in any database. 3 of our researchers have already been transferred to psychiatric facilities, and 2 more have simply vanished from the site." Harrison pulled out a third photograph, this one showing a man Ben didn't recognize, but whose eyes held a look of such profound terror that it made Ben's chest tighten. "Dr. James Wright, our lead researcher. This photo was taken 3 days before he disappeared. He was found a week later, frozen solid, arranged in what our anthropologists describe as a posture of worship. The silence in the briefing room stretched like a taut wire. Ben could hear his own heartbeat, unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Sir, are you telling me we're dealing with something supernatural?" Harrison's laugh was bitter and short. Supernatural implies something beyond nature. What we've found suggests that our understanding of nature has been fundamentally incomplete. The Vatican has a file on creatures like this that dates back to the 4th century. The Soviets found similar entities in Siberian ice and managed to keep it classified for 40 years before their entire research team. Well, let's just say the Chernobyl incident wasn't entirely nuclear. Ben felt his worldview cracking like ice under pressure. How many people know about this? Fewer than 50 worldwide, and that number keeps getting smaller. Harrison stood and walked to the window, staring out at the Carolina morning as if he might never see daylight again. "Ben, I'm sending you and your team because you're the best we have. But I'm also sending you because if this thing gets out, if it reaches populated areas, someone needs to be there who's capable of making the hard choice." "What choice?" Harrison turned back to face him, and Ben saw something in the Colonel's eyes that he'd never seen before. Genuine terror. The choice to burn it all down rather than let it spread. The weight of the mission settled on Ben's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't about protecting scientists or securing research. This was about containing something that could threaten the fundamental nature of human existence. "What's our cover story?" "Routine security detail for a geological survey. Your team has been selected for cold weather expertise and discretion. The official record will show a 3-month deployment for ice core research." "And the unofficial record?" "There won't be one. If you succeed, this conversation never happened. If you fail..." Harrison didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Ben had been through enough classified briefings to know when he was being told only part of the story. But he also knew Harrison well enough to trust that if the Colonel thought this mission was necessary, then humanity's future might depend on its success. "We're ready, sir. But I need to know what we're really walking into." Harrison pulled out one final photograph, and this one made Ben's blood run cold. It showed the same creature from the first image, but this time its eyes were open. Even through the grainy surveillance footage, even separated by thousands of miles and a sheet of paper, those eyes seemed to look directly into Ben's soul. "That photo was taken yesterday," Harrison said quietly. "The creature has been frozen for what our experts estimate to be between 10,000 and 50,000 years. It should be dead. It should be nothing more than a perfectly preserved corpse. But it's not. No, it's not. And yesterday, for the first time since we've been monitoring it, it moved." The equipment bay felt different as Ben briefed his team. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher than usual, casting shadows that moved in ways that didn't quite match the movement of people beneath them. Each man had been chosen not just for their skills, but for their psychological profiles, their ability to function under extreme stress, and maintain operational security in situations that defied explanation. Corporal Rick Torres was checking his demolitions equipment with the methodical precision of someone who understood that his tools could be the difference between life and death. At 25, Torres had already earned a reputation for staying calm under pressure and finding creative solutions to impossible problems. He'd earned his nickname Torch during a particularly hairy situation in Syria, where he'd used homemade thermite to breach a reinforced bunker while under heavy fire. But what Ben valued most about Torres wasn't his technical skill. It was his ability to process impossible situations without losing his sense of humor or his humanity. "Cross," Torres said, looking up from his equipment. "I've been thinking about the gear manifest for this mission. We're packing enough firepower to level a city block plus experimental ammunition I've never seen before. The rounds are marked with symbols that aren't in any military database I know of. What exactly are we expecting to shoot at?" Ben had been hoping Torres wouldn't notice the unusual ammunition, but the kid was too sharp to miss details like that. Honestly, I don't know, but Command thinks we might need more than standard rounds. Sergeant First Class Sam Cole was methodically cleaning his rifle, a ritual he performed before every mission. At 43, Cole was the kind of soldier who could put a bullet through a dime at 800 yards and sleep like a baby afterward. The death of his daughter Sarah 2 years earlier had carved lines into his face that made him look older than his years, but it had also given him a perspective on mortality that Ben hoped might prove valuable in extreme circumstances. "The psychological evaluation they put us through last week," Cole said without looking up from his weapon. "That wasn't standard either. Questions about religious beliefs, exposure to trauma, family history of mental illness. They were screening for something specific." Ben nodded. Cole's observation skills were part of what made him an exceptional sniper, but they also meant he picked up on details that others might miss. Private First Class Nick Stone, the youngest of the group at 22, was double-checking his cold weather survival gear. Stone had grown up in Alaska, which meant he understood cold weather operations better than most, but his background in wilderness survival was what had really qualified him for this mission. He'd spent summers working as a guide in the Alaskan wilderness, learning to read weather patterns, ice conditions, and the subtle signs that could mean the difference between life and death in extreme environments. "Guys," Stone said, holding up one of the medical kits they'd been issued. "These contain drugs I've never heard of. Antipsychotics, hallucinogen inhibitors, something called cognitive stabilizers. What kind of geological survey requires this kind of medical preparation?" Ben looked at the faces of his team, 3 men who'd followed him through hell and back, who deserved to know what they were walking into, but he also remembered Harrison's warning about the price of knowledge. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had kept men alive through impossible situations. "I can't tell you everything about this mission, because I don't know everything myself. What I can tell you is that we're dealing with something that's classified at levels that go beyond anything we've encountered before. The official story is that we're providing security for a research operation. The reality is that we might be the last line of defense between whatever's down there and the outside world." Torres laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that had a nervous edge to it. "Come on, Cross, you're making it sound like we're going to fight monsters or something." Ben met his eyes and didn't smile. "Maybe we are." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These men had seen combat in some of the worst hellholes on Earth, but they had always been fighting other human beings. The possibility that they might face something else entirely changed the fundamental nature of what they did. "Whatever's down there," Ben continued, "we face it together. We watch each other's backs, we trust our training, and we remember that our job is to protect people who can't protect themselves." "Questions?" Cole spoke first. "If this thing is as dangerous as you're implying, why aren't they sending a full battalion? Why just the 4 of us?" "Because," Ben said, remembering Harrison's final words, "sometimes the biggest threat isn't what you're fighting. Sometimes it's making sure the fight doesn't spread to innocent people." The journey to Antarctica was a masterclass in military logistics and psychological warfare. The first leg took them to a staging area in New Zealand, where they underwent additional briefings that revealed nothing and psychological evaluations that seemed designed to probe for mental weaknesses rather than assess fitness for duty. Dr. Angela Reeves, the military psychologist assigned to their final evaluation, was a thin woman with the kind of piercing intelligence that made Ben uncomfortable. She asked questions that seemed innocent, but probed areas of the mind that most people preferred to keep private. "Sergeant Cross," she said during his individual session, "have you ever experienced what you might describe as supernatural phenomena? Dreams that felt more real than reality? Voices that seemed to come from sources you couldn't identify?" "No, ma'am." "Have you ever felt compelled to act in ways that didn't align with your conscious desires?" Moments where you felt like you were watching yourself from outside your own body. Ben studied her face, trying to read the motivation behind the questions. "Doc, are you asking if I've ever been possessed?" Dr. Reeves didn't smile. "I'm asking if you understand that the human mind is more fragile than most people realize, that exposure to certain stimuli can cause breaks in consciousness that feel completely real to the person experiencing them." "What kind of stimuli?" "The kind you might encounter at your destination." She closed his file and leaned forward. "Sergeant, I want you to understand something. The men who've come back from Station Ice 9 aren't the same people who went there. Some of them report experiences that are clinically impossible. Others have suffered complete psychological breaks that appear to have no underlying cause. What happened to them? They've been transferred to specialized facilities where they can receive appropriate care. But Sergeant Cross, if you, or any of your team, begin experiencing unusual phenomena, dreams, visions, voices, compulsions, I need you to report it immediately. The survival of your mission may depend on recognizing when your perceptions can no longer be trusted." The flight from New Zealand to McMurdo Base was aboard a military transport that had been modified in ways that seemed both subtle and disturbing. The interior was lined with what appeared to be copper mesh, and the communication equipment included devices that Ben didn't recognize. When he asked the flight crew about the modifications, they claimed it was electromagnetic shielding for sensitive equipment. But their eyes held the same haunted look he'd seen in Colonel Harrison. During the flight, Torres discovered something that made everyone's blood run cold. Hidden in the cargo compartment, sealed in a container marked with biohazard warnings, were doses of what the manifest described as emergency termination protocols. "Cross," Torres said, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "These aren't medical supplies. This is a binary nerve agent, military grade, enough to kill everyone in a facility the size of a small town." Ben stared at the container, understanding dawning on him like a sunrise he didn't want to see. They weren't just being sent to contain a situation. They were being sent with the means to sterilize it completely if containment failed. "They're not planning on anyone coming back, are they?" Stone asked. Ben thought about Colonel Harrison's final words, about the choice to burn it all down rather than let something spread. "I don't think they know what they're planning. I think they're hoping we'll figure out the right choice when the time comes." McMurdo Base was a temporary stop, long enough to refuel and pick up additional supplies, but even there Ben noticed details that didn't fit the cover story. The base personnel avoided eye contact, spoke in hushed tones, and seemed genuinely relieved when Ben's team boarded the helicopter for the final leg of their journey. The pilot, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, who looked like he'd been flying in Antarctica since the continent was discovered, provided the most honest assessment Ben had heard yet. "Station Ice 9, Murphy said over the headset, his voice competing with the rotor noise. "I've been flying supplies there for 6 months. In that time, I've brought in 47 personnel. I've only flown 12 back out, and those 12... He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're not the same people I flew in. Whatever's happening at that station, it changes people. Changes them in ways that don't show up in medical exams." "What do you mean?" Ben asked. "They stop making eye contact. They speak in perfect unison sometimes, like they're sharing thoughts, and they all have the same dream." "What dream?" Murphy's knuckles were white on the flight controls. "They dream about flying, not an aircraft, but with wings. They dream about seeing the Earth from above, watching civilizations rise and fall, like waves on a beach. They all describe it exactly the same way, down to the smallest detail." The helicopter flew through weather that seemed designed to kill them. Winds that changed direction without warning, snow that fell in patterns that didn't match any meteorological model, and temperatures that fluctuated wildly despite the supposed consistency of Antarctic climate. But but it was the aurora that really disturbed Ben. The lights in the sky weren't the gentle, flowing patterns he'd seen in documentaries. They pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberately, moving in formations that looked less like natural phenomena and more like signals. "Never seen the lights act like that," Murphy commented, following Ben's gaze. "Started about 3 months ago, right around the time the drilling operation reached maximum depth. Local weather stations can't explain it. Magnetic readings are off the charts." Station Ice 9 materialized out of the blizzard like something from a fever dream. The complex was larger than the photographs had suggested, with multiple levels carved directly into the ice shelf, and connected by tunnels that seemed to descend far deeper than any surface facility should require. As they approached, Ben could see the drill site, a perfect circle cut into the frozen ground, surrounded by equipment that hummed with power that seemed excessive for geological research. But it was the personnel he could see moving around the facility that really caught his attention. They moved with a coordination that seemed unnatural, following patterns that looked more like choreography than work assignments. The helicopter touched down on a landing pad that had been carved out of solid ice with mathematical precision. The moment the doors opened, the cold hit them like a physical assault. But it wasn't just the temperature. The air itself felt wrong, charged with an energy that made every nerve ending scream in protest. Dr. Emma Vale met them at the entrance, flanked by 2 security guards whose eyes never seemed to blink. She was younger than Ben had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of intense focus that came from spending too much time staring into microscopes. But when she shook his hand, her skin was unnaturally warm, despite the Antarctic cold, and her grip lingered just a moment too long. "Gentlemen, welcome to the bottom of the world," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Ben's teeth ache. "I hope you're prepared for what you're going to see. I should warn you, what we've discovered here challenges everything we thought we knew about human history, about the nature of reality itself." As they passed through the airlock, Ben noticed that the facility's construction was far more sophisticated than any research station had a right to be. The walls were lined with materials he didn't recognize, and the air circulation system seemed designed to contain something more dangerous than just cold air. "Dr. Vale," Ben said as they walked through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, "how long have you been stationed here?" 6 months, she replied, but something in her tone suggested that time might not mean the same thing to her anymore. "Though sometimes it feels like I've been here much longer. Time moves differently when you're this close to something that's existed for millennia." The tour revealed a facility that was anything but standard. Computer systems hummed with processing power that could run NASA's mission control, analyzing data streams that scrolled too fast for human comprehension. Containment chambers lined one wall, most empty, but several occupied by specimens that made Ben's vision blur around the edges just looking at them. But it was the main laboratory that truly revealed the scope of what they were dealing with. A vast chamber carved out of the ice and lined with reinforced concrete, containing equipment that seemed to belong more in a science fiction movie than a research facility. Computer workstations ringed the room, their screens displaying 3-dimensional models and data analysis that hurt to look at for extended periods. And at the far end of the room, behind a viewing window made of reinforced glass 3 inches thick, was the thing that had been waiting under the ice. Ben stared through the window and felt something fundamental break in his understanding of the world. The figure inside was humanoid, but wrong in every way that mattered. 12 feet tall, with 6 wings folded against its back like a grotesque parody of classical religious art. Its features were too perfect, too symmetrical, like someone had tried to sculpt the ideal human form and succeeded too well. But it was the creature's face that truly disturbed him. Beautiful in a way that made Ben's chest tighten with inexplicable emotion, but with an expression of such profound intelligence that it seemed to be looking directly into his soul, even through closed eyelids. "This is our primary discovery," Dr. Vale said, stopping before the viewing window. "We found it 3 weeks ago, perfectly preserved in a natural ice pocket 3.2 miles down. Carbon dating gives us inconsistent results, but geological analysis suggests it's been frozen for at least 10,000 years, possibly much longer." Torres stepped closer to the window, his demolitions expert's eye studying the chamber's construction. "Doc, those aren't natural ice formations around it. Someone built this prison deliberately." Dr. Vale's smile was radiant and terrible. "Very perceptive, Corporal. The ice chamber isn't a natural formation. It's a containment system built by a civilization that understood what they were dealing with far better than we do." "What civilization?" Ben asked. "One that left no other trace of its existence, no tools, no buildings, no artifacts, just this chamber and the warnings carved into its walls." Ben studied the markings that covered the chamber walls through the viewing window. They weren't random scratches or primitive cave paintings. They were complex, organized, systematic, like writing, but in a script that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at it. "Have you been able to translate any of it?" "Some of it. The symbols that repeat most frequently translate roughly to concepts like teacher, watcher, and the one who brings change. But there are other markings, warnings that are much clearer. Do not wake the sleeper. Knowledge has a price. The gift becomes the curse." Stone was examining the containment chamber's construction through the window. "Dr. Vale, what's that equipment around the specimen? It doesn't look like standard preservation gear." Ben followed Stone's gaze and saw what he meant. Banks of sophisticated monitoring equipment surrounded the creature, but some of the devices seemed to be active rather than passive. They weren't just observing the specimen, they were interacting with it in some way. "We've been conducting limited tests," Dr. Vale admitted. "Electromagnetic stimulation, neural mapping, attempts to understand the creature's biological systems. The results have been illuminating." "What kind of results?" Dr. Vale's eyes took on the same bright intensity Ben had noticed in the other personnel. "The creature responds to stimulation. Its neural activity increases when we run certain frequencies through the containment chamber. We've detected brainwave patterns that suggest not just consciousness, but active thought processes." Ben felt ice form in his stomach. "You mean it's alive?" "More than alive, it's aware. And we believe it's been trying to communicate with us since the moment we discovered it. Something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. The figure inside was humanoid but wrong in every way that mattered. 12 feet tall, with 6 wings folded against its back, like a grotesque parody of classical religious art. Its features were too perfect, too symmetrical, like someone had tried to sculpt the ideal human form, and succeeded too well. The skin was pale as fresh snow, unmarked by time or decay. Ancient markings covered the ice chamber walls, carved with precision that suggested intelligence far beyond primitive humanity. The creature's face was beautiful in a way that made Ben's chest tighten with inexplicable emotion. High cheekbones, a perfectly proportioned nose, lips that seemed carved from marble. But the eyes were what made his blood run cold. Even closed, there was something about them that suggested they were merely resting, not dead. "Jesus Christ," Torres whispered. "What the hell is that thing?" "Language, Corporal," Dr. Vale said, but there was no reproach in her voice. "We're not entirely sure what it is. Carbon dating gives us inconsistent results. Some tests suggest it's been frozen for thousands of years. Others indicate geological ages. The ice formation around it is unlike anything we've seen before. It's not just frozen water, it's crystallized in patterns that don't occur naturally." Cole stepped closer to the window, his sniper's eye studying the creature with professional interest. "It's not human." "No," Dr. Vale agreed. "It's not. But it's not animal either. The bone structure is too sophisticated. The musculature too purposeful. The wings aren't vestigial or decorative. They're functional, designed for flight in a way that would be aerodynamically perfect. Whatever it is, it was designed for something specific. Stone was examining the markings on the chamber walls, through the window. Those symbols, they're not random scratches, they're deliberate, organized like writing. That's what we think too. We've been working with linguists from Harvard and Oxford, but the script predates every known form of writing by thousands of years. Some of the symbols appear in various ancient texts, but always in contexts that were dismissed as mythology. Ben noticed several scientists wearing dark sunglasses despite the artificial lighting. When he asked about it, Dr. Vale hesitated before answering. "Eye strain from the equipment," she said, but something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. "We've been working around the clock since the discovery. Some of the team have been experiencing sensitivity issues." "What kind of sensitivity issues?" "Headaches, difficulty sleeping. Some have reported visual disturbances when looking directly at the specimen for extended periods." A technician approached Dr. Vale with a clipboard, speaking in hushed tones that Ben couldn't quite overhear. Whatever the man said made Dr. Vale's face go pale. "Gentlemen, I need to attend to something urgent," she said. "Dr. Morrison will show you to your quarters. We'll continue the tour tomorrow morning." As they were led through the facility to their assigned rooms, Ben caught glimpses of other areas that hadn't been part of the official tour. Laboratories with equipment that looked more military than scientific. Computer terminals displaying what appeared to be satellite surveillance data, and personnel who moved with the practiced efficiency of intelligence operatives rather than researchers. Their quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable, with heating systems that worked overtime against the Antarctic cold. Each room had a small window that looked out onto the endless white expanse, but Ben found himself avoiding looking outside. There was something about the landscape that felt actively hostile, as if the ice itself was watching them. That first night, Ben lay in his assigned bunk staring at the ceiling, listening to the facility's mechanical heartbeat. The heating system worked overtime against the Antarctic cold, but there was something else in the air, a chill that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. When he finally drifted off, the nightmares began. He found himself falling through endless ice, deeper and deeper, while something with too many eyes watched from the darkness below. The creature from the containment chamber was there, but it wasn't frozen. It was moving, speaking in a language that predated human civilization, and somehow Ben understood every word. "You've come to set me free," it said, its voice like the sound of glaciers cracking. "You've come to carry my message to the world above. I've been waiting so long for worthy vessels." The creature's wings unfurled, revealing a span that seemed to stretch into infinity. Its eyes opened, and Ben saw galaxies spinning in their depths, stellar formations that had died before the Earth was born. "Do you know what you are, little soldier? You are the key to a door that has been locked for millennia. Through you, I will touch the world again." Ben woke to find frost on his breath, even though the heating system was working perfectly. His watch read 3 a.m, but he could hear movement in the corridors outside, footsteps that seemed to follow no particular pattern. When he listened closely, he could swear he heard voices speaking in languages that shouldn't exist. He dressed quickly and stepped into the corridor. The facility was supposed to be operating under minimal staffing at night, but he could see lights under several doors and hear the hum of active equipment. Someone was working, even at this hour. The others were experiencing similar dreams. When they gathered for breakfast the next morning, the exhaustion was visible on all their faces. Cole mentioned seeing his daughter Sarah in the ice, calling to him with a voice that sounded exactly like she had when she was 5 years old. She was trapped down there, in the ice with that thing, begging me to help her, to get her out. It felt so real I could smell her shampoo. Stone talked about voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, ancient tongues that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his mind, like someone was downloading information directly into my brain. I woke up with a nosebleed and these words in my head that I can't even pronounce. Torres just looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I dreamed I was flying, he said quietly, not in a plane or helicopter, just flying with wings like that thing in the chamber. I could see the whole world spread out below me, and it was all wrong. The continents were in different places, the oceans were different colours, like I was seeing Earth from a long time ago. It's the isolation, Dr. Vale explained when Ben brought it up during breakfast. Happens to everyone down here eventually. The mind starts playing tricks. We've all been having unusual dreams since we found the specimen. The psychologists say it's a normal response to stress and sensory deprivation. But Ben had served in enough isolated locations to know the difference between cabin fever and something else entirely. The facility felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath. Personnel moved through the corridors with the careful steps of people walking through a minefield. Dr. Vale led them on a more complete tour of the facility that morning. The scale of the operation was staggering. Multiple laboratories, each specialized for different types of analysis. A communication center that could maintain contact with research stations around the world. Living quarters for a staff of 40, though Ben counted fewer than 30 people in the facility. "Where is everyone?" he asked. "We've had some staff rotations recently," Dr. Vale said, her answer coming a little too quickly. "The isolation can be difficult for some people. We've had to send several team members back to civilization for psychological evaluation." They visited the drill site itself, a massive operation that extended deep into the ice. The drilling equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of boring through rock and ice with precision that seemed almost surgical. Computer monitors displayed real-time data from sensors placed throughout the shaft, measuring everything from temperature to seismic activity. The drilling process took 2 months, Dr. Vale explained. We went down in stages, taking core samples every 100 feet. For the first 2 miles, everything was normal. Ice formation consistent with geological surveys. Occasional organic matter that you'd expect from ancient atmospheric deposits. "What changed?" Torres asked. "At 2.8 miles, we hit something that shouldn't have been there. A void in the ice, perfectly spherical, about the size of a small building. The temperature inside was different from the surrounding ice. Warmer. And the ice itself was structured differently, crystallized in patterns that don't occur naturally." She pulled up a 3-dimensional model on one of the computer screens. The image showed the drill shaft descending through layers of ice and rock, then opening into a perfect sphere suspended in the frozen earth. The chamber containing the specimen was at the bottom of this void. Not carved out, not formed by natural processes. It was there already, like it had been waiting for us to find it. The power fluctuations started on the 4th day. Lights would flicker in sequence, following some pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The computers registered electromagnetic anomalies that coincided with unusual aurora activity overhead. Security cameras caught glimpses of shadows moving through empty corridors, always just out of frame, always just beyond explanation. Ben reviewed the security footage himself, studying each frame with the attention to detail that had kept him alive through 3 wars. The shadows weren't tricks of light or camera malfunctions. They moved with purpose, following patterns that suggested intelligence, and they were getting bolder. Dr. Vale's assistant, Dr. Paul Gray, was found sleepwalking in the drill chamber at 2 in the morning, speaking in what sounded like ancient Aramaic. The security guard who found him said Gray was standing at the edge of the shaft, arms outstretched, speaking to something in the depths below. When questioned, Gray claimed no memory of the incident, but his eyes held a distant look that made Ben uncomfortable. "I've been having the most extraordinary dreams," Gray confided to Ben during lunch. "Visions of cities that have never existed, technologies beyond our current understanding. It's like someone is teaching me things while I sleep." "What kind of things?" "Mathematics, physics. Concepts that our current science hasn't even begun to explore. I've been taking notes when I wake up, and the equations, they're beautiful. They describe relationships between matter and energy that could revolutionize our understanding of the universe. Ben asked to see the notes. What Gray showed him was disturbing, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented. Pages of calculations written in a handwriting that was clearly Gray's, but describing concepts that were far beyond anything in current scientific literature. The mathematics was elegant and complex, like nothing Ben had seen before. "Where did this come from?" Ben asked. "I told you, dreams. But they're not really dreams, are they? They're more like lessons, like someone is teaching me, showing me how the universe really works." That night, Ben stationed himself outside Gray's quarters. If something was affecting the man's sleep, he wanted to see it for himself. What he witnessed made him question his own sanity. At exactly 2 a.m, Gray emerged from his room, but it wasn't the same man Ben had spoken with at lunch. His movements were too fluid, too graceful, as if he was floating rather than walking. His eyes were open, but seeing something that wasn't there. He moved through the corridors with perfect navigation, avoiding obstacles in the dark, as if he could see in perfect detail. Ben followed at a distance as Gray made his way to the specimen chamber. The creature was still frozen in its crystalline prison, but the ancient markings on the walls were glowing with a faint blue light that hurt to look at directly. Gray stood before the viewing window and began to speak, but not in any language Ben recognized. The words seemed to flow like music, rising and falling in patterns that suggested meaning beyond human understanding. And as he spoke, the glow from the markings grew brighter. Ben was reaching for his radio to call for backup when Gray suddenly stopped speaking and turned around. For a moment, their eyes met, and Ben saw something looking back at him that wasn't entirely human. "He's awakening," Gray said, his voice carrying harmonics that made Ben's bones ache. "The great teacher is stirring. Soon he will share his wisdom with all of us." Then Gray's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed. When Ben reached him, the man was unconscious but breathing normally. His skin was cold to the touch, and frost had formed on his clothes despite the facility's heating. Ben carried Gray back to his quarters and called Dr. Vale. When she arrived, her reaction was more resigned than surprised. "How long has this been happening?" Ben asked. "Since we found the specimen. It's getting worse, more frequent, and it's not just Gray anymore. Half the research team has been experiencing similar episodes." "What do you think is causing it?" Dr. Vale hesitated before answering. "We think the specimen is responding to our presence. The neural activity we detected is getting stronger. Whatever it is, it's not as dormant as we initially thought." The next morning brought worse news. The electromagnetic anomalies were increasing in frequency and intensity. Computer systems throughout the facility were experiencing glitches and data corruption, and the temperature readings from the specimen chamber were rising, despite the fact that the refrigeration systems were working at maximum capacity. Dr. Vale called an emergency meeting in the main laboratory. The exhaustion was visible on everyone's faces, dark circles under their eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and disturbing dreams. "The situation is evolving faster than we anticipated," she began. "The specimen is showing signs of increased neural activity. We're detecting brainwave patterns that suggest not just consciousness, but active thought processes." "You mean it's thinking?" Stone asked. "We believe so, and we think it's trying to communicate." Torres laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Communicate? With who?" "With us. The sleepwalking episodes, the shared dreams, the electromagnetic anomalies. We think they're all connected. The specimen appears to be reaching out telepathically, trying to establish contact." "Contact for what purpose?" Ben asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "We're not sure, but we've been analysing the mathematical equations that some of our team members have been producing during their episodes. The calculations describe technologies that are centuries ahead of our current capabilities, faster than light travel, matter transmission, even what appears to be some form of time manipulation. Cole stood up from his chair, his face pale. "You're talking about it like it's some kind of teacher, like this is a good thing. But I've seen what it does to people. Gray can barely string together a coherent sentence when he's awake. Half your research team looks like they haven't slept in weeks. Whatever this thing is, it's not trying to help us. It's doing something to us." Dr. Vale's expression hardened. The knowledge it's sharing could advance human civilization by thousands of years. The medical applications alone could eliminate disease, extend human lifespan indefinitely. We're talking about technologies that could solve every problem humanity has ever faced. "At what cost?" Ben asked. Before Dr. Vale could answer, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, bathing the laboratory in red light that made everyone's faces look like death masks, and in that moment of darkness, Ben could have sworn he heard something that sounded like laughter echoing from the depths of the facility. When the normal lights returned, the markings around the specimen's chamber were glowing brighter than ever before, and through the viewing window Ben could see that the creature's eyes were open, staring directly at them with an intelligence that made his blood freeze. The electromagnetic pulse hit without warning on the 7th day. Every system in the facility shut down simultaneously, plunging Station Ice 9 into darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the distant howl of the Antarctic wind. Emergency generators kicked in after what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. In those brief moments of total blackness, Ben could have sworn he heard something that sounded like singing. Voices raised in harmonious chorus using words that predated human language. When the lights returned, everything had changed. The markings around the specimen's chamber were no longer glowing. They were blazing with light so bright it was painful to look at directly. The creature's eyes were not just open now, they were aware, tracking movement through the viewing window with the focused attention of a predator studying its prey. Dr. Gray disappeared that night. Ben found his quarters empty at the morning head count, the door standing open, and his bed unslept in. They searched the entire facility but found no trace of him. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. They found his body the next day. A routine check of the drill shaft revealed him 300 feet down, frozen solid and embedded in the ice wall, as if he had been pressed into it like soft clay. His arms were outstretched toward the depths, his face turned toward the specimen chamber far below, but his expression wasn't one of fear or pain. It was peaceful, almost serene, like someone who had finally found what they'd been searching for their entire life. "He must have fallen," Dr. Vale said, but her voice lacked conviction. "The shaft isn't properly secured. In his sleepwalking state, he could have wandered too close to the edge." But Ben had examined the scene personally. There were no impact marks, no signs of a fall. Gray's body was positioned too precisely, placed with deliberate care in a location that would be immediately visible to anyone looking down the shaft, and his clothes showed no signs of the violent tumbling that would result from a 300-foot fall. It was a message, a demonstration of power. That was when the entity began communicating more directly, not with words, but with thoughts that appeared in your mind like they'd always been there. It didn't speak so much as it shared, passing along concepts and ideas that human language couldn't properly contain. It spoke of knowledge beyond human comprehension, of truths that could elevate humanity to something greater than it had ever been. The first person to admit direct contact was Dr. Morrison, a quantum physicist who had been with the project since its inception. During the morning briefing, he stood up and announced that he had been chosen to serve as an interpreter for the great teacher. "It's not what we thought," Morrison said, his eyes bright with something that might have been fever. "It's not some primitive creature preserved in ice. It's ancient, yes, but sophisticated, intelligent beyond our comprehension. It wants to help us." "Help us what?" Ben asked. "Evolve, transcend. It's been waiting for us to find it, waiting for us to be ready for what it has to teach. The knowledge it possesses could solve every problem humanity has ever faced. War, disease, death itself. These are just obstacles to be overcome with the right understanding." Morrison began drawing diagrams on the whiteboard, complex equations that seemed to shift and change even as he wrote them. The mathematics was beautiful in a way that made Ben's head ache, describing relationships between matter and energy that defied conventional physics. "It's showing me how the universe really works," Morrison continued, "how space and time are just illusions, how consciousness can be transferred between physical forms, how death is simply a transition to a higher state of being." Ben watched the other scientists' faces as Morrison spoke. Half of them were nodding along, their eyes showing the same bright intensity. The other half looked terrified, backing away from the whiteboard as if the equations themselves were contagious. That night, Ben accessed Dr. Vale's computer files while she slept. He'd learned enough about computer security during his years of covert operations to bypass her password protection without leaving traces. What he found made his hands shake as he read. The entity had been identified through cross-referencing with Vatican archives, occult texts, and archaeological reports dating back centuries. Its name was Azazel, one of the Watchers described in apocryphal texts that had been removed from the Bible for being too dangerous. The files detailed similar discoveries throughout history, all ending in disaster. Ancient civilizations that had encountered similar entities, all destroyed from within by knowledge they couldn't handle. The Sumerian Empire had collapsed overnight after discovering what their texts called the sleeping gods beneath the earth. The Mayan civilization had simply vanished, leaving behind only warnings, carved in stone, about the teachers who speak in dreams. According to the records, Azazel had been cast down not for rebellion against divine authority, but for teaching forbidden knowledge to humanity. Technologies and concepts that had driven entire cultures to madness, knowledge that was too advanced for human minds to process safely. But the entity claimed to be a benefactor, a teacher who only wanted to help humanity reach its full potential. It showed those who listened visions of what they could become, what they could achieve with the right guidance. Cities that floated in the sky, machines that could reshape matter at the molecular level, technologies that could extend human life indefinitely. The price for this knowledge was simple: worship, devotion, the complete surrender of human will to the entity's guidance. Cole started experiencing visions of his daughter Sarah 2 days after Morrison's announcement. She would appear in reflections, in shadows, in the corner of his vision, calling to him with a voice that sounded exactly like she had when she was alive. She told him the angel could bring her back, that death was just another barrier to be overcome with the right knowledge. Ben watched his most reliable soldier slowly crumble under the weight of impossible hope. Cole would stand guard at the containment chamber for hours, staring at the creature with an expression of desperate longing. His rifle hung forgotten at his side as he pressed his face against the viewing window, breathing words that sounded like prayers. "She's in there?" Cole whispered to Ben during one of these vigils. "Sarah? I can see her sometimes, standing behind the angel. She's been waiting for me, waiting for someone to set them both free." "Cole, that's not your daughter. Whatever you're seeing, it's not real." "How do you know?" Cole's eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from lack of sleep. "How do you know what's real anymore?" The things I've seen, the knowledge that's been shared with me, our understanding of reality is so limited. Death isn't the end. It's just a different state of being. Ben tried to reason with him, but Cole was beyond reach. The entity's influence had taken root in his mind, feeding on his grief and guilt over his daughter's death. Every conversation ended the same way, with Cole returning to the viewing window to stare at the creature with the devotion of a true believer. 2 more scientists vanished over the next few days. Dr. Harrison, a geologist who had been instrumental in the drilling operation, and Dr. Phillips, a linguist who had been working on translating the markings found in the specimen chamber. They simply disappeared from their quarters in the middle of the night, leaving behind only clothes and personal effects. They were found later, arranged in ritualistic poses around the drill site. Their bodies were frozen solid, but their faces were peaceful, almost serene. They had been positioned with deliberate care, their arms outstretched towards the depths as if offering themselves to something below. But it was their eyes that disturbed Ben the most. Even in death, they remained open, staring into the depths of the shaft with expressions of profound satisfaction, as if they had finally achieved something they had spent their entire lives seeking. The entity was growing stronger. Its influence was spreading through the facility like a virus, touching the minds of anyone who spent too much time in its presence. The temperature fluctuations became more extreme, rooms switching from freezing to sweltering without warning. The facility's systems couldn't keep up with the changes, and personnel began reporting hallucinations, auditory phenomena, and shared dreams where they all stood before the creature and received its teachings. Dr. Vale called another emergency meeting, but by then half the research team had become willing converts. They sat around the conference table with the same bright-eyed intensity that Ben had seen in Morrison, their voices harmonizing as they spoke about the wonderful future that awaited humanity under the guidance of the great teacher. "The specimen has made contact with 12 members of our team," Dr. Vale announced. "They report receiving detailed information about advanced technologies, medical procedures that could eliminate aging, and scientific principles that could revolutionize our understanding of the universe." "What's the cost?" Ben asked. "Because there's always a cost." Dr. Vale hesitated. "The process appears to require complete psychological integration with the entity's consciousness. Those who have been chosen report feeling a profound sense of connection, of purpose. They describe it as the most beautiful experience of their lives." "You mean they're being possessed?" Torres said bluntly. "That's a very crude way to put it," Dr. Morrison interjected, his voice carrying harmonics that made Ben's teeth ache. "We're being elevated, enhanced. The great teacher is sharing knowledge that will transform our species." Ben studied the faces around the conference table. The converted personnel all shared the same expression of serene certainty, while the unaffected scientists looked terrified. The division was clear and growing stronger by the hour. "What does it want?" Ben asked. "Freedom," Morrison replied. "The ability to share its gifts with the world. For too long, humanity has struggled in ignorance, limited by primitive understanding of the universe. The great teacher wants to guide us to our true potential. And what's stopping it?" Morrison's smile was beautiful and terrible. "The ice, the primitive containment systems built by those who fear knowledge. But soon, very soon, those barriers will be removed." Ben realized with growing horror that the converted personnel had been working to free the entity from its prison. They'd been using their access codes and scientific expertise to gradually disable the containment systems, raising the temperature in the specimen chamber degree by degree, melting the ancient ice that held the creature captive. That night, Ben gathered Torres and Stone in his quarters. Cole hadn't been seen since the morning briefing, and Ben suspected he'd joined the ranks of the converted. "We need to get out of here," Torres said, checking his sidearm for the 3rd time. "Call for extraction, get back to civilization, and let someone else deal with this nightmare. With what? Ben asked. What do we tell them? That we found a frozen angel that's telepathically converting the research team? They'll think we've gone insane. Maybe we have, Stone muttered. Maybe this whole thing is some kind of mass hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. But even as he said it, the lights flickered in that now familiar pattern, and they could hear singing coming from somewhere deep in the facility. Voices raised in harmonious chorus, using words in languages that had been dead for millennia. Ben pulled out the communication equipment and tried to raise McMurdo base. Static filled the radio, broken by occasional bursts of what sounded like the same singing they could hear echoing through the corridors. Communications are being jammed, he realized. Whatever that thing is, it's interfering with our ability to call for help. They spent the next few hours planning their escape. The helicopter that had brought them was still on the landing pad, but it was designed for short-range transport, not the 1,000-mile journey back to McMurdo. Their only hope was to reach one of the other research stations scattered across Antarctica, but that would mean crossing hundreds of miles of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Before they could put their plan into action, Cole appeared in the doorway of Ben's quarters. He moved with the same fluid grace that Ben had observed in Grey, his eyes reflecting light in a way that seemed unnatural. "You don't understand," Cole said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "You're fighting against salvation. The great teacher wants to help us, to show us truths that will transform our species." "Cole, fight it," Ben said, reaching slowly for his weapon. "Whatever it's doing to your mind, you can resist it." "Why would I want to resist it?" Cole's smile was radiant. "I've seen Sarah again, Ben. She's more beautiful than ever, more alive than she was before the accident. Death isn't the end. It's just a transition to something greater." Cole raised his rifle with mechanical precision, but his movements were too fluid, too perfect. Whatever was controlling him had access to his muscle memory and training, but not the hesitation and imperfection that made him human. Torres dove left as Cole fired, the bullet sparking off the metal wall, where his head had been moments before. Stone rolled right, coming up with his sidearm drawn, but Cole was already moving, flowing around their defensive positions like water. Ben tackled his former teammate, and for a moment they grappled on the floor of the small quarters. Cole's strength was inhuman, far beyond what his frame should have been capable of, but more disturbing was the expression on his face, serene, peaceful, even as he tried to kill his oldest friends. "You'll understand soon," Cole whispered as they struggled. "The great teacher has plans for all of you. You'll be honored to serve as vessels for his return to the world." Torres ended the fight with a precise blow to Cole's temple, a move that should have rendered him unconscious. Instead, Cole simply smiled and went limp, his eyes rolling back to show only white. "Is he dead?" Stone asked. Ben checked for a pulse and found one, steady but slow. "No, but he's not really alive either. Whatever that thing did to him, it's turned him into some kind of puppet." They bound Cole with equipment straps and locked him in one of the storage rooms. As they worked, they could hear more singing from the depths of the facility, and the lights continued their rhythmic flickering. The temperature throughout the facility began to fluctuate wildly. Rooms would be freezing one moment and sweltering the next. The facility's systems couldn't keep up with the changes, and personnel began reporting hallucinations, auditory phenomena, and shared dreams where they all stood before the creature and received its teachings. Ben made the decision to reach the communication center and try to send a distress signal, even if it meant going through the converted personnel to get there. They armed themselves with everything they could carry and prepared to fight their way through their former colleagues. The corridors of Station Ice 9 had become a nightmare landscape. The converted personnel moved through them with purpose, but their movements were too coordinated, too perfect. They worked together like a hive mind, anticipating each other's actions in ways that no group of individual humans ever could. Ben's team encountered the first group near the main laboratory. Dr. Morrison led them, his face glowing with fanatic devotion. Behind him were 6 other scientists, all moving in perfect synchronization. "Sergeant Cross," Morrison said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the walls themselves seem to vibrate. "The great teacher is disappointed in your resistance. He had hoped you would be among the first to accept his gifts." "What gifts?" Ben asked, keeping his rifle trained on Morrison's center mass. "I've seen what your great teacher does to people. That's not enlightenment. It's possession." "Such a limited perspective," Morrison replied. "We are being elevated, transformed into something greater than mere human. The knowledge we've gained, the technologies we now understand. We could reshape the world, eliminate suffering, transcend the boundaries of mortality itself. At what cost? There is no cost, only transformation. The great teacher asks only for our willing cooperation, our acceptance of his guidance. Through us, he will share his wisdom with all of humanity." The converted personnel began to advance, moving with the fluid coordination of a single organism. Ben's team opened fire, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The converted scientists staggered when hit but continued moving, as if pain was simply irrelevant to them. Torres used a thermite grenade to clear a path through the group, the intense heat and light sending the converted personnel scrambling for cover. But even as they retreated, Ben could hear them laughing, as if this was all some elaborate game. They fought their way through 3 more groups before reaching the communications center. Each encounter was more disturbing than the last. The converted personnel showed no fear of death, no concern for their own safety. They attacked with the coordination of a military unit, but the fervor of religious zealots. The communications center was a disaster. The equipment had been systematically destroyed, not by violence, but by careful dismantling. Every critical component had been removed or damaged beyond repair. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were targeting. "They don't want us calling for help," Torres observed, surveying the wreckage. "No," Ben agreed. "They want whatever's happening here to stay contained until it's ready to spread." That was when they heard the explosion. A deep, rumbling boom that shook the entire facility, followed by the sound of collapsing ice and twisted metal. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the station, and a computerized voice announced hull breach warnings in multiple areas. They raced through the corridors toward the source of the explosion, but Ben already knew what they would find. The converted personnel had detonated charges in the drill shaft, collapsing the upper sections and opening a direct path between the specimen chamber and the facility above. The drilling equipment lay in twisted ruins around a gaping hole that descended into darkness. Cold air rushed up from the depths, carrying with it the sound of singing that was no longer muffled by ice and stone. Dr. Vale stood at the edge of the collapse, her arms raised in supplication, her voice joining the chorus that echoed from below. Behind her, the remaining converted personnel formed a circle around the opening, their voices harmonizing in languages that predated human civilization. "It's beginning," Vale called out when she saw Ben's team. "The great teacher is rising. Soon he will walk among us again, and the world will be transformed." From the depths of the shaft came a sound like the beating of massive wings. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made every nerve-ending scream in protest. And rising from the darkness came a light that was somehow darker than the shadows around it. The entity was no longer contained in its crystalline prison. The ice had been shattered, the ancient barriers that had held it captive for millennia finally broken. It rose through the shaft like some impossible dream made manifest, its 12-foot frame moving with grace that defied physics. Its wings spread wide as it emerged into the facility proper, each feather gleaming with its own inner light. Its face was beautiful beyond human comprehension, features so perfect they seemed carved from living marble. But its eyes, Its eyes held the accumulated wisdom and malice of eons, depths that contained the memories of civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity ever existed. "My children," the entity spoke, its voice bypassing sound entirely and resonating directly in their minds. "You have done well. The barriers are broken, the prison is opened. Now begins the great work of transformation." The converted personnel fell to their knees as one, their faces turned upward in expressions of religious ecstasy. Even at a distance, Ben could feel the entity's influence pressing against his mind, offering knowledge and power beyond imagination. "You have resisted well, little soldier," the entity said, its attention focusing on Ben with laser intensity. "Such strength of will is admirable. You would make an excellent vessel for my return to the world above." Ben raised his rifle, though he knew conventional weapons would be useless against something that existed as much in the realm of thought as in physical reality. "I've seen what you do to people. That's not salvation, it's slavery." "Such a limited perspective," the entity replied, echoing Morrison's earlier words. "I offer transcendence, evolution, the chance to become something greater than your species has ever achieved. The civilizations I have guided in the past reached heights of knowledge and power that your current science cannot even imagine." "And where are those civilizations now?" The entity's smile was beautiful and terrible. They transcended physical existence entirely, ascending to a higher plane of being. Their bodies were merely temporary vessels, stepping stones to something far greater. "You destroyed them. I liberated them, as I will liberate you, and through you, all of humanity. The knowledge I possess could solve every problem your species has ever faced. War, disease, death itself. These are merely obstacles to be overcome with proper understanding." The entity began to rise again, its wings carrying it toward the surface levels of the facility. As it moved, the converted personnel followed, their faces glowing with fanatic devotion. Ben realized that the creature's ultimate goal wasn't to remain trapped in this Antarctic facility. It intended to reach the surface, to make contact with the outside world, and begin spreading its influence on a global scale. Every person it touched would become another vector for infection, another voice in its growing chorus of believers. They had to stop it before it reached the surface. Ben signaled to Torres and Stone, and they began making their way toward the facility's main power plant. If they could overload the reactor, they might be able to bring down the entire complex and bury the entity under millions of tons of ice and debris. The route to the power plant took them through sections of the facility that had been damaged by the explosion. Ice and debris blocked several corridors, forcing them to take detours through areas they hadn't explored before. In one of these alternate routes, they discovered something that made Ben's blood run cold. A secondary laboratory, hidden behind blast doors that had been left open in the chaos. Inside were dozens of specimen chambers, most empty, but several containing creatures similar to the one that had been freed. Smaller entities, humanoids but clearly not human, preserved in the same crystalline ice formation. "Jesus," Torres whispered. "How many of these things are there?" Ben studied the specimens more closely. Each was unique, but all shared the same perfect, inhuman features. Angels, demons, or something else entirely. It didn't matter what they were called. What mattered was that they were all here, all preserved, all waiting. A placard next to one of the chambers contained information that made Ben's hands shake as he read it. The specimen had been discovered in 1952, frozen in the ice of Greenland. Another had been found in Siberia in 1967, a third in the Canadian Arctic in 1983. This wasn't an isolated discovery. It was part of a pattern that stretched back decades, possibly longer. Governments around the world had been finding these creatures and bringing them to facilities like this one, studying them, trying to unlock their secrets, and now one of them was free. The power plant was located in the deepest level of the facility, a massive reactor that provided energy not just for Station Ice-9, but for several other research installations across Antarctica. The technology was more advanced than anything Ben had seen in civilian applications, suggesting military involvement at the highest levels. Torres began setting charges around the reactor core, while Stone kept watch at the entrance. The plan was simple: overload the reactor, cause a massive explosion, and bring down the entire facility. It would mean their own deaths, but it would also ensure that the entity never reached the surface. As Torres worked, Ben found himself thinking about the broader implications of what they'd discovered. If there were other facilities like this one, other preserved entities waiting to be awakened, then stopping this single creature might not be enough. The infection could already be spreading through government agencies, research institutions, military commands. "Charges are set," Torres announced. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before this whole place goes up." They began making their way back toward the surface, but the converted personnel were waiting for them. Led by Cole, who had somehow escaped from the storage room where they'd left him. A group of possessed scientists blocked their path. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Cole said, his voice carrying the entity's harmonics. "The great teacher has touched minds around the world. Government officials, military leaders, scientists in a dozen different countries. The network is established. Even if you destroy this facility, the work will continue." Ben felt his heart sink as he realized the truth. The entity's influence had already spread far beyond Station Ice-9, through the personnel who had rotated out of the facility, through the scientists who had been transferred to other projects, through the government officials who had been briefed on the discovery. The infection was already global, but that didn't mean they could give up. Even if they couldn't stop the entity's ultimate plan, they could delay it, make it harder to execute. Every day they bought might be crucial for someone else to find a solution. The firefight in the corridors of Station Ice-9 was unlike anything Ben had ever experienced. The converted personnel fought with inhuman coordination, anticipating their movements and responding with tactical precision that suggested a single guiding intelligence. But they also showed no concern for their own safety, throwing themselves into harm's way with the fervor of true believers. Torres used the last of his explosives to clear a path through the main laboratory, but not before Ben caught a glimpse of something that made his blood freeze. The entity itself, no longer confined to the lower levels, had risen to the facility's main floors. It stood in the center of the laboratory like some impossible dream made manifest, its wings spread wide, its perfect features glowing with inner light. But it wasn't alone. The creatures from the secondary laboratory had been freed as well, smaller entities that moved with the same fluid grace as their larger counterpart. They spread through the facility like a plague, touching the minds of the few remaining unconverted personnel and adding them to their growing chorus of believers. "Run!" Ben shouted to his team. "Just run!" They fought their way through corridors filled with the converted, using every tactical skill they'd learned over years of combat experience. But this wasn't like fighting human enemies. These people felt no fear, no pain, no hesitation. They attacked with the coordination of a hive mind and the devotion of religious fanatics. Stone fell first, overwhelmed by a group of converted scientists who moved with inhuman speed and strength. His scream was cut short as they dragged him back towards the laboratory, but Ben could still hear his voice joining the chorus of singing that echoed through the facility. Torres made it almost to the surface before a rifle shot from Cole brought him down. Ben watched his friend's body crumple, blood spreading across the ice floor, and felt something break inside his chest. He was alone now, the last unconverted human, in a facility full of possessed scientists and freed entities. The charges Torres had set would detonate in less than 5 minutes, but Ben wasn't sure that would be enough to stop what had been unleashed. The entity appeared in the corridor ahead of him, its presence filling the space with an oppressive weight that made breathing difficult. Up close, its beauty was overwhelming. Features so perfect, they seemed to bypass the eyes and speak directly to some deeper part of human consciousness. "You have fought well, little soldier," the entity said, its voice like music made of starlight and shadow. "Such courage, such determination. You would make an excellent vessel for my work in the world above." "I've seen your work," Ben replied, raising his rifle even though he knew it was useless. "I've seen what you do to people. I elevate them, transform them, free them from the limitations of mere humanity. The knowledge I offer could solve every problem your species has ever faced. Through me, you could become gods." Ben thought of coal, of Torres, of stone, of the peaceful expressions on the faces of the dead scientists, of the beautiful equations that drove men to madness. "Some prices are too high to pay," he said. The entity's smile was radiant. "Then you will be honored to pay it involuntarily." The creature reached out with one perfect hand, and Ben felt its influence wash over him like a tide of liquid starlight. For a moment he saw what it was offering: knowledge beyond human comprehension, power to reshape reality itself, the ability to transcend death and become something magnificent and eternal. And then he remembered Torres's last words, pressed the detonator in his pocket, and watched the world disappear in fire and light. The explosion that destroyed Station Ice 9 was visible from space, a flash of light that briefly outshone the aurora borealis. The facility, and everything in it, was vaporized in an instant, turned to superheated plasma, and scattered across the Antarctic ice. But Ben survived. He found himself thrown clear of the blast, lying in a snowbank 3 miles from ground zero, his clothes smoking and his skin burned, but alive. The mark on his left hand, a symbol in an ancient script that hadn't been there before, pulsed with warmth against the Antarctic cold. The rescue came 2 weeks later. A search team from McMurdo Base found him half dead from exposure, hypothermic and delirious, the sole survivor of what the official reports would call a catastrophic reactor failure. He was airlifted to a hospital in New Zealand, where he spent 3 months recovering from severe frostbite and radiation exposure. The debriefing came later, conducted by men in black suits who represented agencies that didn't officially exist. They made it clear that Station Ice 9 had never existed, that his team had died in a training accident, that the truth would remain classified at levels that transcended government oversight. But Ben knew they were lying, just as he knew that the entity's influence had already spread far beyond the destroyed facility. He could see it in their eyes, hear it in the subtle harmonics of their voices. The infection was already global, carried by those who had been touched by the creature's presence. They offered him a comfortable retirement, a pension, and a new identity if he promised to never speak of what he had seen. Ben agreed, knowing that it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Back in his apartment in North Carolina, the nightmares began again. But these weren't the random products of a traumatized mind. They were messages, communications from something that had survived the destruction of Station Ice 9. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had simply found a new way to exist, spreading its consciousness through the network of minds it had touched. Ben would wake to find himself drawing intricate patterns on his walls, designs that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The equations were beautiful and terrible, describing technologies that could reshape matter at the molecular level, extend human life indefinitely, or unlock the secrets of faster-than-light travel. But with each equation came a cost. His memories of his old life began to fade, replaced by visions of impossible cities and technologies beyond human comprehension. His personality slowly dissolved, subsumed by something vast and ancient that whispered promises of transcendence and transformation. The entity's voice grew stronger each day, no longer offering knowledge or power, but simply reminding him that burial in ice had never been what kept it dormant. It was the silence that had maintained its prison. The isolation, the lack of human contact. And now, through Ben and the others who had been marked, it was no longer silent. It was whispering again, reaching out through the connections it had forged, touching other minds, spreading its influence one person at a time. Ben stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing something that wasn't quite human looking back. The angel hadn't been destroyed. It had found a new way to escape, a more subtle approach that would take time, but would ultimately be more effective than any single dramatic emergence. The infection had already begun. He could feel it spreading through the networks of human connection, carried by those who had been touched by the entity's influence. Government officials who had been briefed on the incident, scientists who had studied the recovered data, military personnel who had participated in the cover-up. All of them carried a piece of the angel's essence, a seed that would grow and spread until the world was ready for its true emergence. The phone rang, breaking Ben out of his reverie. He answered without thinking, his hand moving with mechanical precision. "It's time," said a voice he recognized from his debriefing, though it now carried harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "We've been waiting," Ben replied, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. "How many are ready?" "More than enough. The network is established. The secondary sites have been activated. We can begin the next phase." Ben hung up the phone and looked at the mark on his hand, which was now glowing with a faint, pulsing light. Around the world, others with similar marks were making similar calls, activating a network that had been growing in secret for months. The real work was only just beginning. Governments had been finding these creatures for decades, studying them in facilities hidden beneath the ice of Antarctica, the permafrost of Siberia, the glaciers of Greenland. Each discovery had been classified, compartmentalized, known only to a small group of researchers and officials who thought they could control and understand these ancient beings. But the entities had been patient. They had allowed themselves to be studied, contained, experimented upon, all while slowly extending their influence through the minds of those who worked with them. The network had grown quietly, spreading through intelligence agencies, research institutions, and military commands around the world. Now, with Station Ice-9 destroyed and the secret partially exposed, the entities had decided to accelerate their timeline. The age of subtle influence was ending. The time for open transformation had begun. Ben walked to his computer and began typing, his fingers moving with inhuman speed and precision. The words that appeared on the screen were not his own, but rather the collective will of something vast and ancient that had been waiting centuries for this moment. The document he created would be sent to thousands of contacts around the world, activating sleeper cells that had been planted in positions of power and influence. Within hours, research facilities on every continent would begin opening their hidden vaults, releasing entities that had been preserved in ice and shadow for millennia. The transformation would be gradual at first, barely noticeable, except to those who knew what to look for. Government policies would shift in subtle ways. Scientific research would be redirected toward projects that seemed beneficial but served darker purposes. Military resources would be repositioned under the guise of routine exercises. And throughout it all, the entities would continue their patient work of conversion, touching minds and spreading their influence until humanity itself became willing participants in its own transcendence. Ben finished typing and sent the document, then walked to his window and looked out at the city beyond. Soon, every person he could see would be touched by the entity's influence. They would be elevated, transformed, freed from the limitations of mere humanity. The thought should have horrified him, but instead it filled him with a profound sense of peace. The old Ben Cross, the soldier who had fought down to protect humanity, was gone. In his place was something greater, something that understood the true purpose of existence. The great teachers had returned, and the world would never be the same. I thought we buried it in the ice, but it's not the ice that kept it asleep, it was the silence, and now it's whispering again, and the whole world is starting to listen.